my granola friend. Guys, how many of you have run a marathon? But be proud, hands up high. So you remember that point at 20 miles? 20 miles in a marathon, you go, damn, 6.2 more miles to go. That's where we are now in today's forum. So thank you all for being here. So let me ask you, I was just hanging out with folks in the back, and I want to thank Joseph Harrington. Give a wave, Joseph, he's in the back. And he slipped me a question, and I think it's a perfect way to start. And I'm going to start with you, Andy, and just sort of say, what is the ideal balance between the ethics and morality of acting in the best interest of patients and a company's fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders, and who decides what is ideal?
Well, there's a question I've never been asked before.
There you go.
That would have been best asked probably to the gentleman from Amgen.
No, but I mean, you're all stakeholders in this system, and you have a perspective. And I think part of what we're going to get into here, what I liked about Joseph's question is there an equilibrium that we ought to be more aware of between the various stakeholders? So there's a profit division, there's a regulatory and a kind of a public health protecting dimension, and then we're going to talk a little bit about value and also patient voice. So just to piggyback on Joseph, are there other models of getting that equilibrium just right from your perspective?
So,
and I understand you're biased, in behalf of your association.
So I'm biased in the sense that I am the only one usually on the stage that has no financial interest in the outcome of the discussion. So that does bias me, but I think in a good way. And my take on that is that I've been in the patient advocacy community for 20 years now, first in the US and now for the last 6 years on the international front.
Right.
I'm a member of IAPA, which is the International Alliance of Patient Organizations, which is 285 patient groups.
Right.
Not once have I ever heard from any patient advocate that they were asked to do something by a pharmaceutical company that was not in the best interest of the patient. So the fact that we may be in alignment on certain issues does not mean, as one of the previous speakers suggested, that I don't know what her comment was, but it was almost as though the industry manufacturers, the originators, had a lock on the patient community, which is, I think, extremely far from the truth. There has been no lock on any patient advocacy group that I've seen by any pharmaceutical company. And so I would say that from their perspective, I have always seen, at least the big pharmaceutical companies that we deal with, that they've always put the patient first.
Right.
And it's not economically good for them for one of their drugs to not work.
Well, Bill sees a lot of patients, and I know, in terms of we think about improving the system, and here we're talking about value and outcomes and where biosimilars play in. How do you see what might be adjusted in a more constructive way and running what you do at Northwestern?
So with respect to what, biosimilars?
Value in biosimilars.
So I think that, we always have to, obviously think about the patient that's sitting in front of us and offer them whatever we think is the optimal therapy, or at least suggest that they receive that. At the same time, I think we're in an era now where we have to have some societal concerns. I mean, we don't apply that to the individual patient, but it just came from another panel where we were talking about something completely different, but the issue is incremental improvements in outcome at what cost? And oftentimes that is a societal issue.
Right.
And I think we're going to have to make judgments about that as a community, whether it's physicians, whether it's government, whatever. But we always want to provide to our patients whatever we think is the optimal therapy. But when we talk about incrementalism, particularly in oncology, there's another angle of it too, and that is the cost. What's the value added to a given therapy? And I think that's something that's creeping into our consideration when we talk to patients, when we make guidelines for what we think is optimal therapy for any patient.
Ellen, patient voice. And you were the person, I don't know if you were in the first session, I was actually referring to you. And you said this is all hokey, not meaningful unless cost is really, did I quote you correctly?
I'm not sure, but
according to my notes, I did.
The essence of it.
Yeah.
So, cancer patients are suffering under enormous financial hardship.
Right.
And if the price advantage doesn't get through to them, then it's not a meaningful choice. The point, that was just made about value and incremental benefit is a huge issue. And if you've met one cancer patient, you've met one cancer patient. And each patient has a different set of priorities and values, and they really should have the opportunity to make choices based on what's important to them. I just wanted to make one point about the corporate social responsibility piece.
Right.
Because I wrote my law school thesis on it, but also because I think it's a huge issue for pharma, and I think that's where regulation may be able to play a role.
Can I ask you a question? You know, one of the things that I found interesting, again, coming back to pricing and value and sort of looking at what's evolving in the industry, when the EpiPen controversy occurred and Heather Bresch, the CEO of Mylan, was out there saying, yes, we raised our prices, but it's not just us. There's an ecosystem, there's pharmacy benefit managers, there are other elements of the ecosystem that are involved in the pricing, et cetera. And I know this is different, but I'm wondering if we're missing part, as we're discussing pricing benefits, are there parts of the ecosystem in healthcare that we ought to be discussing this morning on the stage that we're not? Bill, you know, I know, I just wonder, how do you get your handle around so many of the, you know, whack-a-mole cost parts of the industry that we're talking about innovation in one small sliver without really discussing the broader industry this morning?
Right, and I'm personally not an expert on the bureaucracy of healthcare delivery, but one thing that we do appreciate—
But you live amidst it,
One thing we do appreciate on a daily basis is to try and get something approved for one patient is a labyrinth of activity and phone calls, which requires staff on our end to be doing that kind of stuff, staff on some other end. You know, it's just layers and layers and layers that we have created in our healthcare system, and that's all a cost that's invisible. You don't see that, you don't even think about it.
Right.
But it's there, and it's really represents one of the huge costs to the system.
Right. And Andy, you know, in terms of the, when you're dealing with the global Colon Care Alliance, you know, do you think about those different factors as well? I mean, we're talking about biosimilars as a disruptor in one small part of the industry and the value that that may or may not bring. But how do you approach the other parts of the health ecosystem that you're concerned about?
Well, when we talk about the value of biosimilars, I think the patient community as a whole is excited about biosimilars. They're excited about the idea that there will be other choices for physicians. They're excited about the potential cost savings to the system because, you know, let's think outside the U.S. Let's think about other developing countries. So they will have access to drugs they wouldn't otherwise have access to as biosimilars start hitting the market and the cost savings start to come in. And again, we're very early in the stage, especially here in the U.S. In a couple of years, you're going to see 5 or 6 or 7 biosimilars to choose from for each indication. And so, you know, when that happens, clearly price is going to be driven down. And so we're excited that because in other countries, as the price comes down, that increases access. There's more patients that will then have access to that biologic therapy. And so in the colon cancer community, when we look at the impact that biologics have had, which is, you know, arguably tripling the life expectancy of metastatic patients in the last 15 years since the introduction of biologic therapies. And we're talking about going from 10 months of life to 3 years of life. That's a big, big, big public health success story. So we want biologics, we want more biologics, we want biosimilars to come to market. But we don't want them to come to market if they're not going to be safe, and if they're not going to be effective, and if there's not going to be uptake. And so the real question that I think that we're driving to here is what will increase uptake from the patient viewpoint, right? And so what I think would increase patient uptake and physician buy-in is 2 things, data and transparency.
So
things that
what
we're
is the
talking
state of
about
that?
earlier.
If I can share something personal about you, I know that you lost your mother to colon cancer, and that helped trigger your creating this alliance and building it out. Again, in this area, one of the things that I find, the disparities, to go back to our friend over here, that I find in this field is you find some parts of the country where you've got cancer centers and unbelievable cooperation of the players in the region in sharing data. And then you go to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you see lots of moats and walls and whatnot that inhibit. I can even bring, you know, leading practitioners and research scientists from Harvard or, you know, other of the universities there, and they look at those as, you know, almost, they cloak it in HIPAA, but almost as property rights issues, and so the sharing is less, and they admit this and acknowledge it. on the record, and they think it's, so what is, when people talk about sharing data, they talk about it if it's just easy and fluid and happening. My sense is it is not. So am I wrong?
You're not wrong. The data and sharing the data is a hot issue. It's an issue that was addressed at a panel yesterday about how patient advocates can get access to the data and help use that data to change policy. And there are many ways that the EMA, that the FDA have put in place where patient advocates actually have the ability to have their voices heard. And the EU, actually at a conference last week in Miami, introduced data of how patient advocates actually, they've been tracking the impact that patient advocates being involved in the R&D process, the clinical trial process, and the data process has actually moved policy more than 50% of the time. And so our voice is becoming stronger and stronger as time goes on that exact issue. But getting back to what you had said earlier, that when you're looking at data and from the patient and the physician community, what they want, and the survey data all around that supports this, is they want to know that the biosimilars have been properly studied, that they're safe, that they're effective, and that they're just as good as the originator biologic. And in order for the patient and physician community to feel that way, which will then, I believe, increase buy-in and therefore uptake, there's got to be the data element, something I think the EU, and I don't think there's anybody here from the EMA to throw tomatoes at me, but I would call their 12 years experience with biosimilars as a missed opportunity, because the FDA clearly is requiring very strong post-marketing data collection for every biosimilar that's approved. And the EU has not mandated manufacturers to collect that type of data. And so while we know—
So you think that's an inappropriate constraint?
I do. I think it's a missed opportunity that if the EU had demanded for 12 years good, strong post-marketing pharmacovigilance and data collection, we would then be able to say, look, we've had these drugs now for 12 years, and we've had all these approvals, and we've done really good post-marketing data. Here's the outcomes. That doesn't exist. We know where there hasn't been millions of people dying from biosimilars. That's great. And we're really, again, excited to get them to market, but there has to be data, and then the second element is transparency. There has to be transparency so that patients and physicians know what the patient is getting, and it goes back to the state issue that was discussed earlier, that the states have, in the United States, control over interchangeability. 45 out of the 50 states now have passed legislation that requires the physician to be notified if a switch takes place. So imagine, from the cancer patient's perspective, you're on a biologic, it's working for you, and a payer makes the decision that they're going to switch you to a biosimilar. And but for this legislation in 45 states, you would have never been notified. And more importantly, your healthcare provider would have never been notified that that switch took place. There would be an incomplete record. And so for some patients, that would matter. So if something changes in that patient's care, the physician wouldn't even know that the medicine was changed. And so data collection, transparency leads to confidence, leads to greater uptake of biosimilars. I've just solved the problem.
Ellen, I know that CancerCare provides unbelievable support, services, counseling, helps to enhance literacy among those suffering with cancer. This is a cool topic, I think. I actually love these evolving industry topics because they're so new. They're still in embryonic stage at assembly. So from your experience, kind of dealing across this board, what can the industry screw up on that it shouldn't? What are the things that it needs to really get right? Because every new industry has blind spots. So what's your counsel?
So I believe that patient-reported outcomes, PROs, can play a huge role in monitoring the impact of biosimilars. And if there are nuances in the way the patient reacts, those nuances can be documented through PROs. I think there has been...
And are PROs standardized enough that they're... Okay.
No, they're not.
Did I just open up a bad box? Yeah.
I think, those are in the process of being standardized. There's lots of work being done in that area. The studies, the safety and efficacy studies are done in well-controlled trials. They are done on populations that are carefully regulated, and I think something like 60% of oncology care is oncology treatment is off-label. So there will be lots of patients using these products that may not have been in the clinical trial population. And PROs can help to monitor the impact.
Bill, how would you shift it? Because I can't even imagine the world you live in. I mean, essentially, I'm imagining your world of running a major healthcare system, having enormous numbers of patients, and the legendary chaos of records, and then I just read Joe Biden's book about his son Beau Biden, and where his son was taking pictures of electronic records from one cancer center and sending it by FaceTime to his somebody else, a doctor down in Texas, and it just sounds I would never want your job, but I'm just sort of interested in how would you advise the industry on how would you make your world better in terms of dealing with some of these issues?
Well, with respect to medical records, I mean, electronic medical records are the panacea that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So, we have them in our individual institutions, but of course there isn't a lot of cross-communication yet. And until we have that, it's just a different version of trying to copy paper. I mean, you're photographing records like you described. Now, with respect to biosimilars, I guess is the question. I think there are two issues, well, there are a lot of issues, obviously, but, I think the level of appreciation by most physicians on what is involved with biosimilar development is probably still very limited. Oncologists or physicians in general probably are most enamored with what's brand new. So, biosimilar doesn't have the same cachet.
Does not have the same kind?
No, from the standpoint of what gets you excited.
I see.
Now, from a standpoint of cost savings and all that kind of stuff, that is critically important.
So is the new thing sort of immunotherapy stuff?
Yeah, a brand new therapy, a new strategy. And I'm not minimizing biosimilars.
Right.
I'm just saying that's one of the challenges, because I think for physicians, you have to convey to them all the hoops that are necessary to go through to get a biosimilar approved.
Right.
Most don't appreciate it, most have no understanding of it. And there are going to be issues in clinic, some of which you alluded to already. Physicians may not even know, as you pointed out, that a biosimilar is being chosen because they're not actually involved. It may be the formulary committee that puts it on. It's not the physician itself. Or you may see a Z or some sort of designation after the drug, and that would be the only way you're ordering biosimilar trastuzumab as opposed to regular. Similarly, there may be obstacles. You create a whole nother level of conversation with patients that may not have been necessary before. If you're switching therapies or you're deciding that you're going to use a biosimilar, you've now created a prolonged interaction with the patient. I'm not saying that's bad, but in a constrained environment where you have little time, that's adding yet something else you have to do, should do, to explain to the patient what's going on with their care, particularly if you're changing something. So these are challenges.
Yeah, fascinating. Before you go to the audience and we go to others that would like to grill us and all this, let me just ask all of you, start with you, Andy. I hear this notion of patient voice being part of the ecosystem much, much more than I used to. It comes up at every healthcare session across every topic and field. And I guess I just want to hear, because I know this is what you do, and you're all involved in patient voice to some degree. How do you make that mean something in a tangible way, a structured way? What are models where it works? What are models where it's superfluous and silly? I mean, I guess it's never silly, but I mean tractionless. Because I'm fascinated in these fields. When I joined the Atlantic many years ago, 7 years ago, and I knew they wanted me to be involved in some events, I said the two topics I disliked the most were healthcare and education, because they were so fuzzy and there were so many kind of moving shadows. I mean, there are areas that would just seem so much. This seems like a world of shadow boxing and others. So when does patient voice matter? How do you structure it in such a... I've changed my view, by the way. I love healthcare events now, just so you all know. But it took me a while, because it's filled with a lot of obscurity.
Yeah, so your question is it's a really good question, and it's really timely, because I had already alluded to a panel that I was chairing last week at the IAPO Congress. And that panel was exactly on that issue. And it had the FDA, it had the EMA, and then it had a guy from Australia who had a real-world example of how he changed policy in Australia. And they really I actually have the presentations if anybody wants it, but the EMA and the FDA have put together incredible programs where the patient voice is now integrated into every aspect of drug development, trial design, all the way through drug delivery and post-marketing surveillance, post-market surveillance. And so EMA, and the most amazing thing out of that panel for me was that the EMA and the FDA meet every 3 months to discuss that issue. And they have heads of those departments who run those patient programs. And they actually meet every 3 months to talk about best practices. And now they're talking about working with the WHO about taking that globally to get all regulators together to talk about how the patient voice can be strengthened. I've already touched upon the EMA data that show that more than 50% of policies changed. What IOPO has done on the biosimilar stage is we have developed, and it was just released last week in Miami, a toolkit for patient advocates on biosimilars. And it's literally a 7-part series of individual booklets of everything a patient advocate and patient advocacy organization, because again, we are made up of 285 patient groups. So each one of these patient groups can customize this in their own languages, their own branding. It's fully free and downloadable on the internet. We mail print copies to anybody that wants it, but it's a 7-booklet series. And we partnered with IFPMA, the International Pharmacy Alliance, to make sure that we had everything, technically, right? Because we don't have the technical capabilities that they would have. But that toolkit is now available, and that is one of the tools that are available to educate all stakeholders in the patient community about getting involved and making sure that data standards remain high as there's a challenge to that now, and to make sure that patient voice remains strong, and most importantly, to make sure our physicians remain relevant. Because there's a push in other countries more so than in the US, but certainly a push in the US with changes in formularies that are really making doctors irrelevant. They're making policymakers and payers determine which drugs patients should get, and they're really making doctors irrelevant. So that's a big challenge to the patient
Bill, your
community.
thought on getting the structure right?
Well, I think it's critical. I mean, that's one of the pushbacks when we talk about biosimilars, and we've both alluded to the fact that we may not be making the decision about what drugs we use.
Right.
Or for that matter, we may not even be aware. We may put trastuzumab into our order set, and what comes out, we're not sure. It's busy. So those things are critical, and I think that physicians have to have a better understanding of what biosimilars are all about. I don't think, quite frankly, I think you should give physicians that toolkit that you were alluding to, because I think most don't really appreciate the preclinical development or even the data that currently exists.
In the Northwestern network, how would you grade the literacy of your practitioners on biosimilars?
They can say biosimilars, but I don't think that they can
So
say which drugs.
There's work to do, so you've got a task, you've got a partner.
I don't think that's unique to us, though.
You're getting real work done here on stage, so Andy, go, you guys have a drink later. Ellen?
So if the price advantage does not accrue to the patient, this is a meaningless choice. The patient has to feel the impact. It has to be in a formulary tier that makes it affordable to the patient, and then they will follow their physician's recommendation. We are working to incorporate what's important to patients into EMRs and into office workflows, so that if there is financial hardship that can really compromise patient adherence to treatment, that's identified early enough so that treatment planning reflects that sensitivity, and we can
just go ahead.
Yeah, and we can help patients to manage the costs associated with their treatment.
I'm rudely stealing Ellen's thing here. This CancerCare Connect booklet series on biosimilars and their role. What does this share with us that we haven't talked about this morning? And can people download it?
So this is for patients. Yeah. It reflects a Connect education workshop that's on our website, cancercare.org. This is a booklet that is written at a 7th grade literacy level We send these out for free to anybody that's interested in them. They're also downloadable from our website, and also in publication form, they can actually be listened to from our website.
I'm so glad I was nosy and looking at what you were looking at over there. Let me open to questions and comments from the audience. Yes, right over here. Whoa, hello.
Wow, sorry.
Dramatic entrance.
So I've had this, I'm June McCoy, I'm from Northwestern University. My views are my own. I'm a physician attorney, so I've been bursting with questions since you started. Number one, I appreciate the information from the gentleman about the EMA. But I think there's, although they might have missed an opportunity, the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, actually authorizes or approves drugs so differently from we do, even in the area of biosimilars.
Right.
So from a legal standpoint in the United States right now, the Public Service Act is what's going to govern biosimilar approval. And as much as I'm an advocate for patients with cancer, my concern is more so what are the safety issues that might actually accrue for these patients. And why am I that concerned? Because I'm not so sure that people are actually being educated about the fact that biosimilars are not interchangeable. We talked about that a lot today, but I'm not so sure the average patient is being told that who has cancer or some other medical condition that requires, like psoriasis, a biosimilar.
Right.
And so my concern actually goes to safety and legal issues, and also what might be providers' legal risk, when they start moving to these biosimilars.
Thanks, Gene. I appreciate that perspective. Andy?
Well, I think it's all about education. Biosimilars are proving to be safe. There's got to be more data to make sure that they're safe. And I'm really happy, as other speakers have said, that the FDA has taken a very science-based approach in approving these biosimilars, and they are requiring solid study data. I think, as an earlier speaker said, the FDA is considered the gold standard. And I would say all countries have to do is look at the WHO standards for approval. Those are also considered to be very high standards for approval. And that has kept, I think, us from feeling what I call is the pop balloon of biosimilars. And that is an example I use when I talk about my experience in this biosimilars arena has been about 8 years, and I've watched this whole balloon of biosimilars growing and growing and growing. More companies getting into it, more manufacturers doing both sides of it, and more products coming to market. And everything's going so well, and the last thing we want is a country that has lower standards to introduce biosimilars, and something goes bad, and a group of patients die, and that whole biosimilars bubble then pops. And everybody gets hurt around the world because you know what happens with viral social media these days. And so the science-based approach that has been done by the FDA, the EMA, and the WHO, I think are a really good thing. There's challenges to that, especially at the WHO level. There's a number of member countries that are calling for lower safety standards, and I think it's a really scary thing.
Bill or Ellen, do you have comments on that?
Well, no, I would echo that. I think that the familiarity I have are with the oncology drugs, not beyond that. And I think those that are available in the U.S. have been held to high standards in terms of the trials done and actually monitoring the safety as well as obviously the efficacy. So I think there is a comfort level with the number of hurdles that are necessary to be met to get something approved in the U.S.
Ellen?
I'd only say that the concept of a biosimilar is quite complex, and patients may struggle with actually understanding how biosimilars are different from generics, and they are used to taking generics. They will defer to the physician recommendation, assuming that there is a cost differential that makes it worthwhile.
You know, I really appreciate Jean, is she still there? Jean's question and comment, because it's sort of where I was coming at, that, you know, last week when we did this program with Commissioner Gottlieb and others, actually had someone on a panel from the National Psoriasis Association. You saw an enthusiasm for possibilities, but politically, and in terms of public pressure, and it may be informed public pressure, or uninformed public pressure, the expectation, the hope, the demands for faster, cheaper, more available drugs on a quicker basis, that is palpable in Washington. Like, you really feel that. And and it's why I asked that question earlier, are there dangers of eroding the, I think what was called the pharmacological vigilance built into the system, and the process which almost every person has said is the gold standard, but you sort of feel that there's building pressure to take it there. So any final thoughts on that and what we need to either do or avoid? Because some people say, well, their efficiency can be achieved because of getting bureaucracy out of the way. But part of that is, do you erode, to just come back to what Jean says, is there a danger of eroding the health standard at some level?
From the patient advocate's point of view, I'm going to call for the highest safety standards possible. You know, if you're going to ask me my opinion, then I want people to know that the regulator has done a science-based analysis and has enough data to make the decision that this product is safe and efficacious. And
right.
And so there's got to be that data there for the regulator to build that confidence that will then lead to the uptake, like I had said earlier.
And
Bill?
in the absence of that, there would be enormous physician pushback. It would be a no-go.
Ellen?
I think that's right.
Ditto. Well, with that, we will end it there. Thank you so much, William Gradishar at Northwestern Medicine's Lurie Cancer Center, Andrew Spiegel from the Global Colon Cancer Alliance, and Eller Miller-Sonet with CancerCare. And thank you very much for sharing with us this booklet. And where can they go get your 7-part deal?
The IAPO website, iapo.org/UK. It's a UK-based organization.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank all of you.